Good afternoon, and welcome to the Daily Kos Elections Q&A. I'll be your moderator, Jeff Singer. I'll be introducing the panel, and once we do that, we'll jump right into your questions. No PowerPoints, no speeches, just your questions, our answers. To ask questions, please use the chat function. You can just type them in, and we'll get to as many as possible in the next hour. I'll be your moderator, Jeff Singer. I'm the elections editor at Daily Kos Elections. And what I primarily do is I write our morning digest, which goes out every weekday morning. It summarizes the big developments in down ballot campaigns. So campaigns for Senate, governor, House, redistricting, some mayoral elections, district attorney races, attorneys general, secretaries of state. Don't think we've hit water board yet, but may only be a matter of time. We have joining us here Gabby Goldstein from Sister District. Gabby is the co-founder and senior vice president of strategic initiatives, and she leads programs that strengthen the pipeline of diverse progressive candidates, as well as programs that educate the public about the importance of state legislatures and policy, and which supports progressive state legislators once they're elected. Sister District was one of the groups that was founded right after the 2016 election, and it's been just this huge, great resource for Democrats down the ballot for state legislature. It's made a huge impact in 2018, 2020, and looking forward to it in 2021 for our races here in Virginia and New Jersey, and nationally in 2022. Next up, we have Matt Booker, also with me at Daily Kos. Matt assembles so much of the data that we rely on. He keeps all our databases up to date. He writes about state legislative elections, which are very often early signs what the climate's going to be like. And he also writes about many of the mayoral races we touch on. Next, we have Carolyn Fiddler, also with me from Daily Kos. Carolyn is our communications director, and she's a Virginia native and political expert. So she will be very high demand for this panel this year, all that's going on in the Old Dominion. And she also is a state legislative expert. She works at the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee. She's a veteran in Virginia politics. She's the one. She is going to be very. We're going to be asking her a lot for a lot of stuff this year.
That's why I'm here.
And last but not least is Stephen Wolf from Daily Kos. He, with me, writes the Morning Digest, and he also has a newsletter, the Voting Rights Roundup, which goes out every Saturday morning. And he writes about the attempts to strengthen and fight back against voter suppression, which includes voter ID, gerrymandering, you name it. Stephen's talking about the wins we're getting, what we're trying to defeat, and he's also in the documentary Slay the Dragon about gerrymandering, which you can find on DVD or streaming. So I've introduced everyone, and we'll be jumping right into your questions. So our first one, how cautiously optimistic should I feel post-California recall and the New Mexico congressional special election we had this June in Albuquerque, and a legislative seat that flipped in New Hampshire?
I would say, just since Virginia is right around the corner, less than a month away, it's terrifying. I would say Virginia is not California. It's not New Mexico. The climate here is definitely more challenging than it was just a year ago, much less 2 years ago when Democrats finally flipped the legislature in Virginia. Amazing. So Democrats are definitely playing defense, and the atmosphere is not as hospitable, but it is the majority is absolutely keepable in the State House of Delegates, which is up all 100 seats next month. And the statewide constitutional elections, governor, LG, AG, feeling pretty good about those. I think we'll keep the majority. By how much Democrats will keep it remains to be seen. There are some opportunities for pickups, but Democrats, like I said, are playing a lot of defense. So be nervous, but not freaking out, please.
Thank you. Yeah, nervous, not freaking out. That is my default state of affairs right now. Our next question is, we have no statewide elections this year in Minnesota. Give me 3 harbinger races you want to be watching for on November 2nd. All right, I will dive in. It's correct, there are no statewide elections this year in Minnesota, but there are plenty of local races. The big ones I'm going to be watching are in Minneapolis. The really big one is a referendum that would replace the Minneapolis Police Department with a new Department of Public Safety. This one is interesting. There's a lot of high-profile people who are taking both sides of it. On the yes side, we have Ilhan Omar, who represents all of Minneapolis in Congress. We have State Attorney General Keith Ellison, who represented Omar's district until 2018. They're arguing, after George Floyd, this is absolutely necessary. We can have public safety, and we can also have reform, and that just attempts to reform the police department are not going to work. On the against side, there's Governor Tim Walz and Senator Amy Klobuchar, who say reform's absolutely needed, but this goes too far. This isn't going to work. So this isn't a Republican versus Democratic race. Democrats are on both sides, but I do think this will tell us a bit where police reform is going, what might be the limitations. So that'll be interesting. 2 more I'd watch, but Virginia, that's sort of the granddaddy of them all. Can't not mention the governor's race. That one's looking pretty close. Virginia's moved a lot to the left in the last few years, but there's this long trend that for governor, it'll vote against the party that just won the White House. And Terry McAuliffe in 2013, he broke that trend when he won for the Democrats, right through Obama. And we'll see if he can do that again. The third one I'd watch, I'd say for just Republicans versus Democrats, it would be the New Jersey legislature. It wouldn't really be for governor. That should be an easy win for Democrat Phil Murphy. But there are a lot of states, especially in the suburbs, especially in the North Jersey suburbs, that they were Republican bastions as late as 2014 or 2012. They moved really against Trump, but there are still Republicans who represent them. So it'll be interesting to see if these areas stay blue, keep going blue, or if there's a little bit of a backlash now that Trump is not in the White House anymore.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, I agree with Carolyn and Jeff that Virginia, just going back to Virginia for a second, absolutely great opportunity for us to hold the majority in the House. But it is not guaranteed, and we have to run through the tape on this one. The thing I would just say there is that Terry McAuliffe, his path to victory may not be exactly where we need folks to turn out and get every last vote to hold on to the House, and so it's not. What's happening with his polls and all the rest, and what happens with Terry and his race may not guarantee that we hold on to the House. So it's absolutely doable, and we should hold on to the House, but it's definitely not guaranteed. And these are really, really tight races, especially in Virginia Beach and a few others. So just a rallying cry to run through the tape on it and not. Joan Walsh had a great piece in The Nation a couple of weeks ago about how the resistance is back in Virginia this year, but it's on the Republican side. And we have to watch that enthusiasm gap, and we have to make sure that our folks are really fired up to hold on to this trifecta.
Yeah, exactly. While we're still on the topic of Virginia, next question, why is Virginia less hospitable ground now? What happened there? It seemed like such a damn success story.
Well, it's less about what happened in Virginia. You're right. Democrats have done a lot of great things in the Commonwealth, secured reproductive rights, voting rights. I mean, honestly, almost across the board, Democrats in Virginia have accomplished quite a lot in almost every issue progressives care about since they flipped the legislature 2 years ago. But Virginia, just outside of DC, and the national climate absolutely has an impact on the Commonwealth. And the national climate is definitely more hostile to Democrats right now. So that is not dispositive, but it does matter.
Yeah, exactly. Our next question, to go to one of the other 4 commonwealths in this country, what does a good Pennsylvania congressional map look like? A tolerable one? A bad one?
Yeah, so in Pennsylvania, you have a Republican legislature and a Democratic governor, Tom Wolf. They are expected to not agree on a map, and that would send the process to court if legislators don't pass anything by the deadline. And since Democrats hold a majority on the state Supreme Court, it's expected that the court itself will draw the next map, just like they did in 2018. Now, back in 2018, the court drew a map that was widely regarded as trying to achieve a partisan fair outcome between the two parties. And right now, I believe that the parties split Pennsylvania seats 9-9. But Pennsylvania is losing a congressional district in reapportionment. And because of that, pretty much every existing district will have to expand and take on new territory. And that'll be particularly problematic for Democrats because that means expanding into conservative, rural, and exurban territory for some of the seats that they flipped in the last few years. Notably, Connor Lamb is running for Senate, and his district in particular have to gain about 100,000 residents from more conservative areas outside of Pittsburgh. That'll be a really tough hole. That district will probably favor Republicans after it's redrawn, no matter how the lines are drawn. A few other districts, northeastern Pennsylvania, in the Scranton area, you have Matt Cartwright in the 8th district. That's already a Trump district that Cartwright was able to hold on to. But if it becomes more conservative, he will have a really hard time, depending on the national climate, and that'll be a tough battle for Democrats too. And then also looking at southeastern Pennsylvania, the suburban districts that Democrats flip will also likely have to expand and become a little bit more conservative. But those Democrats will probably have a better time holding on to those seats, just given the trajectory of educated suburban voters over the last few years. That said, there's no certainty that the state Supreme Court will draw the map. Republicans will certainly try to fight that if they can. They would much rather have a federal court draw the lines, which could result in slightly more conservative districts overall. But generally, we're unlikely to see a massive change in the way that the districts are drawn, simply because you're going from one court map to the other.
Thank you, Stephen. Our next question will go to Matt. It's from me. We just asked about national harbinger elections, and I want to ask somewhat different question. What's an under-the-radar election this year that deserves our attention?
This year, like 2021?
Yeah, or
Yes.
maybe early 2022.
Yeah, I got you. So I'll go to Minnesota, actually, that you were talking about earlier in Minneapolis with the ballot initiative. At the same time, there's a mayoral election happening. And one of the big issues in that election, aside from the public safety department versus police department battle, is just really kind of the power of the mayoral office itself. Jacob Frey is their mayor right now, and he obviously had a very tough year. But there is an initiative, another ballot initiative on the ballot that would possibly change the structure of the mayoral office there. So currently the mayor is basically a glorified city councilman. They have some administrative powers, but a lot of the power is derived from just being simply the mayor, having the visibility, being out front, but they're just a voting member of the council in actuality. So the change, if the ballot initiative passes, that would make the mayor more of a strong mayor, and it would have more of a relationship similar to a governor in a state legislature or the president in Congress, where the mayor is the chief executive and the council is the legislative body. And that's a system, that's the most common system, but there are some pretty big cities in the country. We just saw Fort Worth have a mayoral race a few months ago. That's one of the most prominent cities that has that weak mayor system where the mayor is more of a council member. Phoenix is another one. So it's kind of like, it's really interesting what's happening in Minneapolis. I mean, this fall we could see just a whole radical change to how city government happens. So as far as, effect on the national mood and the 2022 midterms, maybe not as much of impact, but Minneapolis is a major city. It's obviously been a part of the American story the last, year and a half or so. So the fact that that is, we're seeing such radical change coming out of there, that's a big story. So I would say the Minneapolis ballot measure that Singer talked about before, that Jeff talked about before, the public safety one, and also the one strong mayor versus weak mayor, I would say that those could have a really big impact on Minneapolis. And depending on the outcome of those, we could see those happening in big cities across the country.
Thank you, Matt. Please keep the questions coming. Getting a lot of really great ones in chat. We'll go back to Virginia for another one really quickly. As you can imagine, Virginia right now is the center of the political universe. In 2017, we worried about losing the governor's race, but a lot of progressive state legislative candidates helped build reverse coattails for Ralph Northam, who won. Can we see the same thing happening this year?
A, people who were paying attention weren't that worried about Northam losing that year. But B, sorry, I still remember that Morning Joe segment, and it still annoys me 4 years later. Anyway, so yes, there were arguably some reverse coattails in Virginia because Democrats, for the first time in a very long time, had candidates in the vast majority of seats. I want to say it was like 98. Gabby, maybe you remember? It was a lot. Most of the 100 seats, Democrats had candidates, even in completely unwinnable, drawn to elect Republicans seats in far like southwest rural coal country Virginia. This year, Democrats also still have a lot of candidates running. I want to say there are, like 98 of the 100 seats are contested this time around. The vast majority, vast majority. But it's not just about having a candidate in those districts. Remember, Democrats have the majority, so Republicans are now challenging Democrats, some of which haven't had challengers, and some of whom haven't had challengers in a very long time. Thinking of like Ken Plum in Northern Virginia. But so it can work both ways, I guess is my point.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I totally agree. I mean, I think that in very red districts, getting some extra votes for the top of the ticket is great when you have folks running down ballot. VPAP, if you're not familiar with VPAP, they are doing God's work in Virginia electoral data. And they had an interesting analysis of this sort of run everywhere strategy in 2017 in Virginia and sort of the net votes that it got for Northam and so forth. I don't know that it was not dispositive in the Northam victory by 9 points, right? Like, no, but certainly it helps on the margins. I don't think that that's what we're seeing this year. I don't think that that's going to be a significant, it's not, that's not what's going to drive Terry McAuliffe's victory. It's a little different.
Thank you. Next question. What races would you look at in 2020 to see whether 2020 trends of suburban voters trending Democratic and Hispanic voters trending Republican? I assume what races would we look at 2021, 22 to see? 2021 to see. I'll restate it. What races would you look at in 2021 to see whether 2020 trends of suburban voters trending Democratic and Hispanic voters trending Republican, whether that stays?
I'll say there's a couple that actually. Oh, go ahead, Singer.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I would say there's actually a couple that have already happened. One big one, stick to, I talked about Minneapolis before, talking about another mayoral race, city of Plano in North Texas, former suburb of Dallas, really just now at this point, just a part of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex and principal city. There were two Republicans running in that race, but one Republican was running more with the endorsement of the Democratic Party, actually had the endorsement of the Collin County Democrats there. And there was another one who had more, sort of the Trumpy Tea Party type of endorsements. And the Republican who was more moderate, had the Democratic endorsement, won 53-44, I believe the margin was, very similar to the margin that Joe Biden carried the city of Plano in 2020. And that was after years of Plano being, this is George W. Bush, John McCain, Mitt Romney country. This is a, formerly very conservative city. So the fact that Joe Biden won it, and then, later on, almost a year later, 6 months later, Democrats were able to do pretty well there. That's a really encouraging sign in a place that, we weren't sure. A lot of people weren't sure if, the Dems gain in 2020 was very Biden specific. And, that's a data point in the direction of maybe it might be more Dem specific. Just overall, you look at special elections that we've had this year, a lot of suburban areas. We had one in Iowa a couple weeks ago in an area right outside of Des Moines where the Dems still lost, but did a little bit better than the 2020 legislative performance in that district. So overall, there are signs, you can point to probably any number of races where, maybe there's been some reversion, but there's also been a lot of data points towards, okay, yeah, suburbs are, maybe, not here to say necessarily, but not reverting automatically post-Trump into the Biden era.
Jeff, if I could just shout out one thing on this point. Today, great timing on this question, an incredible partner, Way to Win, released a 2020 retrospective analysis, and The Atlantic published a feature about their research, really looking at the 2020 election and what lessons that can be learned from it, particularly looking in the South and the Sun Belt and so forth. So I'd really recommend that folks check out at least the Atlantic article that came out today. It's called "Go West, Young Dems," and check out Way to Win's research on this as well.
Yeah, exactly. Our next question is, we've seen some independent redistricting commissions, new and old, churning out some questionable work this year, and some have even hired consultants with ties to Republican gerrymandering. If independent commissions aren't the answer, what is?
So when we talk about an independent commission, we're talking about taking redistricting out of the hands of legislators and putting it into a panel with members of multiple parties, requiring them to draw lines based on certain nonpartisan criteria. And generally what you have in some of these states is you have a lot of commissioners hired who are not experts. They are just active citizens. So they are not going to be like redistricting nerds knowing all the political geography of their state beforehand. But, getting to the critique of commissions, one of the big problems is that a lot of these commissions focus a lot on procedure and trying to ensure that the process is fair and nonpartisan. They don't have strict standards in place to make sure that the actual outcome is fair and nonpartisan. So if you look at certain states where a political party might be inefficiently distributed by geography, you draw a map with neat-looking districts that follow city and county lines, and it might automatically favor one party by default simply because of where their voters are located. Now, some commissions don't do anything about that. They say, okay, well, the process was free of partisan bias, but the outcome is what it is. Whereas others, such as Michigan's, have a requirement specifically to make sure that the maps are not unfair to either party, and that requirement ranks ahead of some of the other criteria. So in certain states like Michigan, we've seen a lot of drafts that are very heavily favorable towards Republicans in ways that are probably not legal and probably shouldn't be the ultimate map. But that process is still in the middle of happening, and those are not final products by any means. Now, we have seen some states, such as Colorado, drew a map that Democrats were pretty displeased with, but it wasn't quite like it was a full-on Republican legislature just gerrymandering to the end of the earth. But that said, there has been some sign that these independent commissions, they're not fully insulated from political pressure, and one way we can strengthen them is to have more strict requirements that say, look, the map has to pass these certain statistical tests of partisan fairness. A party that is winning the most votes statewide should be winning the most seats. That's a pretty basic rule. That it's not chiseled into the stone of these constitutions in these states. The rules are usually pretty nebulous. But as far as independent commissions go, there isn't a completely alternative approach that is not really on the table in the United States, and that is proportional representation. And under that system, you can have two or more, even more parties winning seats that are pretty close to the share of votes that they win overall. This system is really common in Europe and across the rest of the democratic world, but it doesn't really exist at any substantial level in the United States. But I see Gabby in the chat. Political scientist Lee Drutman has been a big proponent of PR, as have several others in the electoral reform sphere. But it just doesn't have the activist momentum that a lot of these other reforms like independent commissions do.
Yeah, please keep the questions coming. We're getting a lot of really great ones. Our next question, it'll go to Gabby. What's advice that you would give to someone thinking about running for office for the first time?
Do it, right? I mean, look, I think I was thinking before. I don't know if you guys have seen the new Sopranos movie. No spoilers, but there's a great scene in the show where Christopher Moltisanti and Tony Soprano, they're cooking up some burgers in the backyard, and Christopher's trying to get some advice about whether to have a kid, and Tony Soprano says he's so wise about it. He's just like, you know what? Don't think about it too much. It's never exactly the right time. You just jump in with both feet. And I always thought that was really good advice about parenting and or like jumping in. I don't have kids, but it sounds good to me. But I also think it's kind of a good advice about some of the other choices in life that may seem really overwhelming, or we're not prepared for, or we're not ready, and all this sort of thing. Maybe the time's never quite perfect, but maybe it's good enough. And we really need folks to run. And shout out to our friends and partners at Run for Something. Yesterday, they launched, and several other partners, including Emerge, New American Leaders, launched a new initiative on Snapchat, which is very cool, which allows people to sign up to get more information about running for office. And I saw Amanda from Run for Something said that 3,000 people signed up in the first day. So I'm extremely encouraged to hear that, especially young folks, that the kids on Snapchat are thinking about running. And we'll never get to that representative democracy that we want, that reflective democracy that includes all of our voices, if we aren't able to encourage folks to run. And one other thing I'd say about that is it's okay to lose. And we have a cool program this year, a new program at Sister District called Future Winners. In the back of my head, I always thought of it as Losers Academy, but it's not as good a name as Future Winners. And it's a cohort of folks. We're running it in partnership with Run for Something and Emily's List this year. And it's a cohort of folks who ran for state ledge last year and lost by just a tiny bit. And really the idea there, the vision for that program is that we have to stop treating candidates like static electoral objects. We have to invest in people on trajectories of power. And we do that by continuing to support folks after they run and lose. And that's especially important for women, for people of color, folks from non-traditional backgrounds who put everything they had in to run the first time. And the idea of running a second time may seem really overwhelming. So please run, please run again if you lose. We like to say that losses are often down payments on future wins. It's never been easier to find more information about how to run, and we need everyone to do it.
Yeah, amen. Yeah, please keep the questions coming, getting some really good ones. Our next one is, what is the significance of the mayoral race for Miami? So this year, Francis Suarez, he's the Republican mayor of Miami. He's up for re-election, and I wish I could say more than he's probably going to win. Miami does vote Democratic usually, but Republicans have a very strong hold there locally. None of his opponents look particularly formidable. Suarez, he's an interesting guy. He's tried to position himself as the moderate, diverse face of the future Republican Party. I think he was asked about running for president a few weeks ago, and he's like, "Oh, I could," or something like that. Like, going from mayor of Miami to president seems pretty absurd, but well, we've been through an absurd few years. Of South Florida, a nearby race I think we should be watching more is over in Hialeah. I believe has the largest proportion of Cuban Americans of any city. It's really Republican. This is not, unfortunately, a Republican versus Democratic race, but there are some interesting stakes. This is happening on November 2nd. It's one of those nonpartisan primaries where everyone runs on one ballot, and if no one gets a majority, there's a runoff. The two main candidates are former Hialeah City Council President Isis Garcia Martinez. She's a conservative. She's more of the local law in city politics type, and her opponent is former Miami-Dade Commissioner Steve Bovo, he ran for county mayor last year. He lost a pretty competitive race, and so Ron DeSantis, the governor, who I'm sure is a favorite here, he's been implicitly supporting Bovo, hasn't endorsed yet, but I think everyone knows he's his candidate. So this will be a good one to watch for local things. It's not a Republican versus Democratic one, but it's worth keeping an eye on. Our next question, what are the best Senate races to possibly flip next year?
Well, there's two in particular that are probably the quote unquote best. I mean, there's a couple decent ones, but the two best are Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. No doubt about it. Those are states that Joe Biden won in 2020. States that were formerly very Democratic at the presidential election, but I think 2016 shook up a lot of people's understandings of it, especially people that had, kind of been lulled into thinking that 2008 and 2012 were, the standard. And in reality, the last few years, we've seen really close races in both of those states. But those are, just the main ones. Wisconsin has a little bit more clarity, I would say, right now. Okay, neither of them have a ton of clarity because in Pennsylvania, we don't really know who the Democratic nominee is going to be. It's kind of a hard race between John Fetterman, who is the lieutenant governor, and Connor Lamb, who was a representative from the Pittsburgh area, who were kind of duking it out in a, sort of more progressive side for Fetterman and the more traditional Democrat side for Lamb. Wisconsin is a little more settled on the Democratic side. There are a lot of Dems running, but Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes he's got a lot of right now the buzz behind him. He is kind of the main guy there. The uncertainty is if it's going to be an open race or not. Ron Johnson, who is, Jeff talks about Ron DeSantis before. I'm sure that Ron Johnson's a favorite of this chat here. He has not announced if he's going to run for re-election yet. His fundraising numbers have been uneven over the last year or not. So we really don't know who a possible opponent for the Democratic candidate, most likely Mandela Barnes, would be there. So there's things that are unsettled for both of them, but those would be the Democrats' best opportunity. Probably up next, you'd say, you look at, we're probably now talking about states that Donald Trump has won, such as North Carolina. And, really, if we're really going to stretch the board, maybe Ohio. But if we're talking about what's the easy meat on the bone here, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, for sure.
Yeah. Our next question is sort of the other side of that. It's about a defensive seat. How defensible is Reverend Warnock's Senate seat in Georgia? So what I would say is, well, Georgia, we just had a really incredible year. Took its electoral votes for the first time since Bill Clinton in 1992. Not one, but both Senate seats. First time any Democrat has won there since 2000. The Democrat who won there is Zell Miller, the late Zell Miller, ultra conservative guy. Yeah, but the Republicans? They're trying to bounce back. They passed a lot of voter suppression legislation, and even all else being equal, it's still a tough state in what are historically tough midterm years for the party in power. So it's defensible. Warnock proved he was a very great candidate. The Republicans right now, there's a lot of infighting. Trump is going after the governor, Brian Kemp. There could be some bad blood there. And one big X factor is who the Republican nominee is going to be. And the front runner right now, Herschel Walker, he was this former NFL player. He was this huge guy in the 80s at the University of Georgia, which is like state religion in Georgia. Trump endorsed him. Trump recruited him to run. Warnock, though, Walker, he's been out of this. He only recently moved back to Georgia from Texas after a long time away. Yeah, and the 90 Minnesota Vikings. Thank you. And there have been some stories about him. He's first-time candidate. His ex-wife had a protective order against him. The judge in 2005 said, "I'm confiscating your guns." With any first-time candidate, there's a lot of unpredictability involved. Some of them are great. Some of them have some, especially when you go from never running for office to running for the Senate in a swing state. You're going to get a lot of scrutiny. So, going to have to see how that one turns out. And there's some Republicans running against him. Some of them have the money to compete. Some of them have some name recognition. We'll see how that goes. But I think it's Georgia is arguably our toughest hold. It's going to be tough. There's a lot going on there, but I think we can. And I'm told defending Warnock or Kelly, not defeating. There's a typo there. Just happens, but yeah, I think it's defendable. It'll take a lot. We'll need to have some good luck, but I think it's defendable. Matt, you wanted to?
Yeah, because if you want a taste of how Democrats are starting to view Georgia, the down ballot offices, Lieutenant Governor, Attorney General, Secretary of State, some big names. All of a sudden, it kind of was weird. Georgia all of a sudden got a lot of superstars just wanting to. That big name people in the Democratic Party there that now want to run for office. You have B. Wynn, who represents an Atlanta suburb seat, running for Secretary of State. Jen Jordan, who won a big legislative special a few years ago and has become like a really big superstar in the Georgia legislature there. She's running for Attorney General. So all of a sudden, it's kind of Democrats kind of feeling the wind at their backs in Georgia. So Jeff is right. It is a tough state. I mean, it is kind of newly blue, if you want to call it that. It's still, very much an evenly divided state, but you have a lot. And I mean, of course, Stacey Abrams probably running for governor there as well. I mean, you have a lot of, big time talent in the state of Georgia wanting to run for office. So, it's going to be tough, but it's definitely a seat or a state overall where Democrats feel really good because they're really strongly contesting races, at all the levels there.
Yeah, exactly. We'll move to what I think is the other sort of, it's mentioned in the same breath as Georgia as the other big Democratic defense. How defendable is Mark Kelly's seat in Arizona? Georgia's a more base voter state, while Arizona seems to be more an elastic swing state. Do you think we have a better chance of defending Warnock or Kelly?
Well, that seems like a good question for you, Singer, again, but also they're not up at the same time, and who knows what the climate's going to be like.
Oh, Kelly and Warnock are both going to be.
Oh, sorry, not Kelly and Warnock. I was thinking, sorry, Kelly and Sinema. I've got both of them on the brain. My bad.
Oh.
But that seems like a good question for you again, Singer.
Yeah, Kelly, it's a little bit of a different situation. Georgia kind of went from Democrats have been locked out of power for a really, really long time to, it's blue, really not exactly in the blink of an eye, because there were a lot of really close races in between, but a lot did happen in 2020. Arizona, it's been more gradual. Sinema, not our favorite person, but she did score a big win in 2018. Democrats have won more statewide offices than Georgia. So that one, it's really hard to tell because they're different states, different candidates, who has a better chance. But I think it's fair to say that they are the two most vulnerable Democrats. In terms of what the Arizona Republican field looks like, that one is a bit more uncertain than Georgia. Just a lot of candidates running. No clear front runner at this point. The Attorney General, Mark, I can't pronounce his name. I am going to mess that one up, but he
deserves it, and it's Brnovich.
Thank you. Mark Brnovich, he's probably, if the primary took place today, I think he'd win just off name recognition, but Trump really, really, really hates him. And unfortunately, that might be the biggest factor in Republican politics right now. Brnovich, he's a hardcore libertarian conservative, but he did say, well, Biden won the state, and that's how you wind up in the Trump doghouse today. So there's a lot of potential for a lot of infighting there. I don't know whether he or Warnock is more vulnerable. They're both pretty vulnerable. They both can win. We'll see how that one goes. Our next question is back in Wisconsin, while we're talking about Republican defenses, whether we'd rather run against Ron Johnson, yay or nay.
Well, it seems like he's going to have more baggage than a lot of other candidates that can get put up in his place. And so having things to run against is always helpful, as opposed to like a cipher with no background to pin on him, just as a general thought.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, usually the conventional wisdom is you'd rather you don't run against the incumbent because they're established, they have a history, they have experience, but Ron Johnson is really, really bad. It just, what he says about vaccines, that's just, if he retires, which he may, what he's going to do in 2022 is arguably the biggest question of the entire, for Senate races in any state. But I think there are some Republicans who would be a better stand-in than him. There's always the possibility someone much, much, much worse will get nominated. You never know. But I'd rather, personally, given Rojo's weakness, I'd rather run against the devil we know. My next question goes to Stephen. What's a favorite election story you've seen unfold? We've been doing this a while. We've seen some crazy, crazy stuff. What's a favorite story you've seen happen?
Yeah, so I don't think I could go with anything other than this one. But several years ago, I think it was back in 2015, there was a city, a really small city in Missouri. I want to say it was in the center part of the state, where at the local level, they were drawing this business district, and the idea was to draw it with 0 voters so that only the businesses in the district would be able to decide something about taxes. And they ended up drawing it so there was a single college student from the University of Missouri. So it's like this whole taxation scheme would have come down to this one college student had that district plan gone through. And unfortunately, the people who did draw that district were able to, I think, successfully rejigger it. So they removed this voter and they were able to pass this business tax hike that they wanted. But it was just really ironic that you see gerrymandering in the news. Usually the people who do gerrymandering get away with it scot-free. In this case, it was poised to just completely backfire on them because they did it in a sloppy manner. So it's just one of those funny stories about, gerrymandering gets a lot of people up in arms. I mean, it is a really big problem, but, it's not bulletproof. And sometimes it really does fail spectacularly.
Yeah, I love that story. That was, I mean, you say one person, some elections are decided by one vote, but usually when we say that, we don't mean there's one person in the entire electorate, but that was quite the story. Yeah, we have a little, Gabby, you wanted to add?
Speaking of one vote, I would say, just to pile in on the favorite stories, Shelley Simons, just want to keep the memory of this alive for folks. She ran for the House of Delegates in Virginia in 2015 and lost. She then ran again in 2017 and lost by a coin toss, literally one vote, and then ran in 2019 and won. And so I wanted to mention Shelley, she's beloved to Sister District. She was also an inspiration for our Future Winners program. It took her 3 runs to win. And that's not uncommon for state ledge candidates. And it really shows the tenacity and the perseverance that she had to keep going. And those losses are often down payments on future wins. So Shelley Simons, 3rd time was the charm. 1 single vote kept her from winning in 2017.
Yeah, your state ledge people on here are pretty well acquainted with elections being decided by 1 vote, because those small districts, those small elections, it's not super uncommon.
Yeah, I mean, this happened to the Boston City Council in 2019. It was for a citywide race. Top 4 candidates win. There was a tie between 4th and 5th. I voted for both the 4th and 5th place candidates, so yeah, I didn't get to be the vote, but I could have been. Yeah, thank you, Adam Bonin. One vote races are silly. Ties are where it's at. Yeah, Adam would know. Adam's the person to call in if you have a tie in the election.
One more tie, another favorite tie for state ledge was Bo Eaton in Mississippi, who also received the exact same number of votes as his Republican opponent. And as per Mississippi state law, they drew straws. But get this, guys. Bo Eaton he drew the longer straw. He was declared the winner, but the Republican supermajority in the House refused to seat him. So he ended up losing, even though he won the game of chance. Anyways, it's best or worst, choose your poison. But Bo Eaton in Mississippi, that was a tough one too.
Yeah. Yeah, we have about 15 minutes left. Please keep the questions coming. We're getting some really great ones. The next one, what's the possibility of Colorado's map being redrawn and dumping Lauren Boebert?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I wouldn't say we should really have much optimism about getting rid of Boebert. She's from a conservative part of the state, in the western part of Colorado, and while there are some pockets of Democratic strength in there, in these ski counties that attract a lot of residents from outside of Colorado, those are not a majority of that district. There's still a lot of rural areas, working class white voters who have shifted hard towards Republicans. The existing district went for Trump by several points, and the revised district that the commission has forwarded to the state Supreme Court maintains that. So she, in a Democratic favoring year, might be vulnerable, but in what is shaping up to be a tough midterm with a Democratic president, Boebert is probably still the betting favorite at this point. Things could always change. I mean, there's no certainty in politics, but she is probably favored by a good bit right now.
Yeah, and I'll add, Colorado, they have an independent redistricting. They have a redistricting commission now. 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, 4 Independents. They did pass a map. Boebert's in better shape than she was now, and her current district is pretty red, as we found out the hard way. The Colorado Supreme Court needs to give it a yes or a no by November 1st. If they say, no, this doesn't conform to the guidelines, we're back to square one with redrawing. But if they sign off on it, that's the map. Right. Yeah, please keep the questions coming. Carolyn, what do you think is a common mistake people make in analyzing elections, and how can they avoid it?
I love that question. I guess my favorite mistake that I see people make most often is not understanding what they don't know, not realizing how nuanced, how particular, how local some elections are, not knowing where to find good data, not following the best political analysts, of which there are several, on this panel. You can't go wrong by following the Daily Kos Elections folks, obviously. But yeah, I think it's sort of a general situational awareness is the biggest error and the most universal error, I would say. But discounting sort of local, those nuances, those local factors that it's really hard to get a sense of from like DC or wherever. I would say that is one of the biggest errors that I see.
Yeah, I'll add, none of us are immune to that because, well, we all live in one place pretty much. Some of us travel, but you can't be familiar with every single electorate. Everyone has its little quirks. At the same time, though, I do think one thing is people sometimes overstate how different their place is. I've heard, if you watch enough campaign commercials like I have, you heard how every single state electorate is smarter than everywhere else and doesn't fall for all that usual bull. And, it's like how every driver's above average. It's not that. People can be more similar than they give themselves credit for in state electorates. Matt, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think a big thing is, and though this is going to sound really cynical, but I mean it's true, is realizing what matters. Because a lot of times, you might hear a politician do an outrageous thing or say an outrageous thing and say, surely this is going to be what tanked him. I mean, we probably all said that about Donald Trump at one point, right? But there was a lot of factors at play, and on the Dem side, Cal Cunningham, right, last year in North Carolina. There's a lot of Democrats that still think, if Cal Cunningham had kept his pants on, we might have that Senate seat. And you know what? I would love to have the North Carolina Senate seat. It would be great to not rely on Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema. But, the bottom line is Donald Trump won North Carolina. That was probably the biggest factor in why Cal Cunningham lost. So, to chalk it all up to his scandal, that might not be the case. And that can go for any number of Republican candidates. A great example is Chip Roy in Texas's 21st in the Austin area. Chip Roy is one of the most conservative members of Congress and has those type of positions. And conventional wisdom might be, surely he's too conservative for his district that Trump only won by a few points, but he still won it. So, there are a lot of times where, it's easy to fall into narratives and say to yourself, this person is unpalatable. They're not going to win, or unpalatability is why this person lost. There's a lot of factors at play. So it's really important to not just get sucked into narratives and to really, look at the data, look at the trends. That stuff may be important, but at the end of the day, you can't just say this person sucks, that's why they're going to lose.
Yeah, Stephen, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, so I wanted to say something about that's important for redistricting, but also just general political prognostication is, I see people making this mistake where they will look at the 2020 election and how it was different from 2016 and just kind of assume that those trends will keep on carrying forward. They look at the suburbs and think, oh, well, here's this district that Trump won by, 5 to 10 points. It'll be blue in several years. We could flip it later. But oftentimes when we're talking about that, it's a district that sure Trump won by 5 points, but Mitt Romney won by like 30 points. So it's a little unrealistic to think a district that already shifted 25 to 30 points might shift another 10 to 15 points in just 4 or 5 or 6 years. And when we're looking at redistricting specifically, it's a much better approach to look at several elections across years and up and down the ballot, rather than fixating on any single election. Yes, the presidential election in 2020 is probably the most important statistic, but it is not the only one. And what we often see, you can look at the 2016 election results specifically, where Trump did a lot better with working class white voters, did a lot worse with educated suburbanites. But the House results in those sorts of districts didn't quite reflect that trend yet. Republicans way overperformed in the suburbs, and a lot of Democrats way overperformed in these rural working class areas. And it takes a lot of time for top of the ticket trends to filter further down the ballot. And that is especially true at the state legislative level. You have these state legislative seats in Appalachia that Trump will win by 30 or even 50 points. There are Democrats that are still competitive. And you'll have some of these suburban seats that Biden won by 20 or 30 points in say, Connecticut, that Republicans are still able to win. So, when redistricting is happening, my favorite approach is to calculate as many races as I can, get all the data I can, and to do some averages and to look at demographic factors and say, like, look, based on demographic trends of the last 10, 15 years, maybe what might we expect this district to look like in, 8 years or so, rather than saying, okay, well, Biden did 5 points better than Trump. Let's just assume that'll keep happening. And that is a common mistake that, is avoidable. And, I wish people would make less.
Yeah, I mean, our next question will go to Gabby. What's the best way that someone can be active in elections if they don't live anywhere near where they can volunteer in person?
I don't know. I don't have any ideas. No, I'm just kidding. It's a great question. I feel like it's a perfect question. So Sister District, for folks who aren't familiar with us, my co-founders and I started Sister District after the 2016 election with the goal of building progressive power in state legislatures. And the idea was, and the name Sister District comes from the idea of a sister city. Our idea was, what if we were able to harness the energy and the resources from folks in one place and leverage those towards specific, strategic, winnable state leg races somewhere else? where we could make a big impact. So this idea of taking resources and energy and moving it to a place that's critically needed is built into it. The DNA of what we do. So if you live in a blue place, and even if you don't, I mean, many of our teams are not in blue places, but many of them are. If you're in a place where your state ledge is pretty safely blue, you like what your state legislators are doing and all the rest, consider joining us. We've got 150 teams around the country, over 50,000 volunteers, and each year we sister up each team to a couple of state ledge candidates for field and fundraising support. So this year we've endorsed 12 candidates in Virginia. Almost all of them are incumbents, because this year is really an incumbent protection game in Virginia to hold on to that majority. And as I said at the top, these races are not guaranteed to go our way. People would consider Virginia to be a safely blue state at their peril. It is not true, and we have to run through the tape. All gas, no brakes. So join us for a phone bank. We've got some fun ones coming up with David Cross, the PodSave guys, others. Spend a little time talking to voters. Give a few bucks if you can. It's a very strong return on investment down ballot, and help us hold on to this trifecta, which has been, I think, as Carolyn pointed out and many pointed out earlier, leading the South and the nation as a bastion for progressive policy. So let's keep it going.
Definitely. We have a few minutes left. If you have any last minute questions, now's the time. Our next one. Most midterm elections are referendums on the incumbent president, which is why the incumbent party usually loses. But with Donald Trump refusing to go away, how much of a factor that things can be different for us in 2022 because Republicans are not going to be running away from him? So how different will things be with Donald Trump just not getting out of the way?
I mean, he's not going to be on the ballot. And I think Georgia showed us how important that is to motivating Republicans. But at the same time, he's also will be not as recent in Democrats' memory. So he won't be motivating folks the way motivating Democrats, I should say, the way that he was. So it's tough to say. And there's so much else at play in 22 between when it comes to redistricting and what the economy is going to be like then, what COVID's going to be like then. But I'm sure other people have sort of more data, nuanced takes on this.
Yeah, Gabby, you wanted to add?
Just a quick thing. So Mike Podhorzer, who is a beloved Politico at the AFL-CIO, is often, I think, correct in making a slight correction on that statement that midterm elections are often thought of as a referendum on the incumbent president's party, but actually it's more accurate to say that midterm performance is a reflection of the out party's enthusiasm and motivation. And so I think that that's an important nuance, because it's not really necessarily about Joe Biden. It's about how control next year, control of Congress next year will really depend on how motivated Republicans are. Not really about Joe Biden's performance and all of the rest is not the sole thing that really is determinative there. So it's just a little bit of a nuance there that I wanted to point out.
Absolutely. We're coming to the end of our panel. Thank you all so much for following us, for your questions, for your comments. Some very great links were shared. And thank you for everyone in the panel for participating. Great job, everyone. Great answers. I learned a lot here. I hope everyone here did too. Let's win some elections.